We're going to begin with the very latest on Israel's offensive. Its military continuing to strike the Gaza Strip by air, sea, and ground. Explosions from the shelling continue to rock neighborhoods in the northern part of the territory. The Palestine Red Crescent Society said a building near a hospital in Gaza City was targeted, and a spokesman for the health ministry in the Gaza Strip says the Israeli military struck a refugee camp, killing at least 47 people. Now, these attacks have been forcing Gazans and foreign nationals to flee to the south. Thousands are gathering near the Rafah border crossing, hoping to get into neighboring Egypt. The CBC's Ellen Morrow is on the outskirts of the city of Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. She has more on the latest on what's going on in Gaza and also at her location.
The Palestine Red Crescent Society says there's been heavy bombardment in the area surrounding Al-Quds hospital in Gaza City. It says that bombardment has damaged the hospital itself, causing dozens of injuries for people inside and people who've been sheltering outside of that facility. The Red Crescent Society says there are about 14,000 displaced people sheltering at that hospital and about 400 patients. We're also learning more about an apparent Israeli airstrike at the Al-Maghazi refugee camp. The Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, says at least 30 people were killed in that strike, and footage of the aftermath shows people digging through the rubble with their bare hands. Now, we're waiting to hear more from the Israeli military on these apparent strikes, but it does fit a pattern that we've seen over the last few days. The IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, says that it's targeting Hamas infrastructure and militants for the October 7th attacks, that those militants and infrastructure are embedded within civilian infrastructure. But when you see these strikes, you see the devastating toll it has on civilians as well.
So that report from our Ellen Morrow, who's on the outskirts of Ramallah. But let's go to Israel and see what's happening there. We're joined once again by journalist Iris Makler, who's in Jerusalem. Iris, Israeli officials have been talking today. What's the latest on that?
We've heard from the IDF spokesman. He usually speaks in Hebrew twice a day. Today, he spoke in English, and I think it's perhaps a sign of the pressure that these images are causing inside Israel, as well as, of course, all the protests we're seeing internationally. So I think he wanted to explain himself in English to a wider public. Let's hear some of what he had to say.
Our strikes are based on intelligence. I repeat, our strikes are based on intelligence. And I want to make sure that you understand that the cynical use of Hamas is not just in hospitals. It's also in ambulances. It's a cynical use of a way to use human shields of civilians and to show the world that we've struck them, because they do a cynical use of hospitals and ambulances, and they want to gain the world's sympathy.
So he presented that as a general view, and then he went into specifics. And those specifics included, the detail of the shifting of fuel. Hamas says, and people in Gaza say, that they're running out of fuel, which affects electricity, let's say, in the hospitals. And he presented evidence, it was like a show and tell, of intelligence that Israel has, that Hamas is actually shifting fuel that it keeps for its own purposes in the tunnels, where it's protecting itself and not the citizens of Gaza, not the civilians of Gaza, and that was brought down to the Jabalia camp so that they could run their operations, if you like, in the tunnels underneath Jabalia. So it's that kind of information that he's presenting to explain why it is that when it's based on intelligence, Israel will strike wherever it is, and that will include, as you remember, we were discussing this a few days ago, Natasha, there was that convoy of ambulances. They said they struck one of the ambulances in that convoy because it was actually filled with Hamas operatives and weapons and not with wounded people at all. So that's part of this ongoing battle of the narratives. But I think at the moment, it's the pictures that win, and they're so strong, and the evidence suffering of the Palestinian civilians is very strong too.
We're hearing from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on this.
We've heard from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today, repeating what he has said almost like a mantra every day. there will be no ceasefire until there's movement on the hostages. And he said that because he said we have to tell our enemies and our friends, I think a sign that he's telling Washington, Canada, Europe, other places where there is great pressure for a ceasefire, that if people want something from Israel, then if Hamas wants a humanitarian concession from Israel, it has to give one in return. Information about the hostages, release of some of the hostages, those issues. Benjamin Netanyahu he faces other problems to do with the hostages, I have to say. Last night there were protests across Israel in various cities with people who are relatives of the hostages and their supporters, calling for some action or more action on the 28th, then the 29th day since the October the 7th attacks. But it sort of bled into a protest against him, against Netanyahu, with calls for him to resign. Today, his heritage minister, so-called, from the very right-wing party, the Jewish Power Party, made a faux pas, so Netanyahu calls it, saying that perhaps Israel would bomb a nuclear bomb, use a nuclear bomb against Gaza, which, you know, the hostages would have to pay the price, as would the civilians of Gaza. So that was so controversial. It's gone all around the world, condemnation from Arab countries, Western countries, and Netanyahu hasn't fired that minister, although he did criticize him. And I think all those things are playing badly for him as judgment calls during this very tense time, during the running of this war.
Journalist Iris Mackler joining us from Jerusalem. Thank you, Iris.